All right, everybody, welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at something I think we all encounter every day. This is carcinogens we're talking about, those substances that have been linked to cancer.
Mm.
We've got this really kind of fascinating but kind of scary list of the top 100 everyday carcinogens, and it really makes you think about all the different things we might be coming into contact with on a regular basis.
Yeah, it can be a little bit overwhelming when you start to think about all the potential risks out there, but I think the key is not to panic, but to use this knowledge to make more informed choices.
I think you're absolutely right about that. So let's not waste any time and dive right into this list. And we're going to cover a wide range of topics here, everything from food and beverages to household products and even the technology in our pockets. But I think a good place to start is with something we can all relate to, food and beverages.
Yeah, that sounds like a great place to start.
All right, so let's talk about barbecue. Who doesn't love a good barbecue, right? But it turns out those char marks on our burgers and hot dogs aren't just a sign of good flavor. They're also a potential source of HCAs and PAHs, and those are chemicals that have been linked to cancer.
You're right about that. When you cook muscle meats like beef or chicken at high temperatures, those compounds can form, and studies have shown that they can actually cause tumors in animals, so there's a real connection there.
Wow, that's interesting. So it's not just, burnt food like my grandma used to tell me, to avoid it. It's something we should really be mindful of. So what about drinks? Are there any surprises there?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is the consumption of very hot beverages like mate in South America. There's actually a higher incidence of esophageal cancer in those populations, and it's not the drink itself, but the constant heat that seems to be the problem.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess it's important to let those hot drinks cool down a bit before we, you know, gulp them down.
Yeah.
I know I'm a big tea drinker, and I always let my tea cool down a bit before I drink it. What about you?
Yeah, I do the same thing. It's just a simple habit that can make a difference in the long run.
Absolutely. So speaking of things we consume, the recent news about aspartame being classified as possibly carcinogenic by the IRRC really caught my attention. I mean, that's in so many diet drinks and sugar-free products.
Yeah, it's definitely something to be aware of, but it's important to understand what that classification means. Possibly carcinogenic doesn't mean that it definitely causes cancer. It just means that there's limited evidence in humans and that more research is needed.
So it's something to keep an eye on, especially if you're a regular user of artificial sweeteners like myself. I'll admit I do reach for those sweeteners sometimes, but this new information might make me rethink that a little bit. So what else is lurking in our kitchens that we should be aware of?
Well, there are a few things. Processed meats like bacon and sausage are classified as group 1 carcinogens, meaning there's strong evidence that they can cause cancer in humans. And then there's red meat alcoholic beverages, aflatoxin, which is a type of mold that can grow on things like peanuts and salted fish. Even some pickled vegetables and fried starchy foods have been linked to cancer.
Wow, that's a lot of things to think about. Seems like so many things we eat and drink regularly could potentially increase our risk of cancer.
It's true, but I think the key takeaway here is that moderation is key, and staying informed about the latest research can help us make healthier choices. But let's move on from the kitchen now and talk about those household products we use every day. I mean, there are potential carcinogens lurking there as well.
You're right about that. And I think one of the biggest surprises for me was learning that that new car smell we all love is partly due to benzene, which is found in gasoline and is a known carcinogen.
Yeah, and benzene isn't just in cars. It can be found in paint solvents and even some air fresheners, so it's definitely something to be aware of, especially since it's been linked to leukemia.
Wow, air fresheners. I use those all the time to make my house smell nice. I had no idea they could be a source of benzene. So what can we do to reduce our exposure?
Well, one thing you can do is choose air fresheners that are made with natural ingredients and avoid those that contain synthetic fragrances. Another common culprit is formaldehyde, which can be found in building materials, cleaning products, and even some cosmetics.
Formaldehyde, isn't that the stuff they use to preserve specimens?
It is, but in household products, the levels are much lower. Still, prolonged exposure, especially in poorly ventilated areas, can be harmful. So it's important to make sure you're ventilating your home properly by opening windows and using exhaust fans.
That's good advice, and I'll definitely be checking my air fresheners for formaldehyde from now on. But it's amazing how many things in our homes could be hiding these risks. We've also got dry cleaning chemicals, scented candles, and pesticides on this list. It's like a constant reminder that even small exposures can add up over time.
You're right. It's the cumulative effect that we need to consider. So it's important to be aware of the products we're using and to make choices that minimize our exposure.
So we've talked about food and beverages and household products now. Let's move on to Some of the more personal care items.
Yeah, let's talk about beauty and potential risks.
So we've all heard about the controversy surrounding talcum powder, right? Have you ever used talcum powder?
I have, but it's important to differentiate. Talc that's contaminated with asbestos is definitely carcinogenic. It causes mesothelioma. But asbestos-free talc is classified as probably carcinogenic specifically for ovarian cancer. And the concern is that those talc particles can migrate into the ovaries, potentially causing inflammation and increasing the risk.
I see. So it's best to err on the side of caution. I actually switched to cornstarch-based powder a while back just to be on the safe side.
Yeah, that's a good alternative.
Another one that worries me is hair dye. I mean, if hairdressers have an increased risk of bladder cancer from working with it all the time, what does that mean for those of us who color our hair at home?
Well, it's important to remember that hairdressers have prolonged high-level exposure, which is different from occasional personal use. The older dyes were definitely more problematic. They contained chemicals that have been linked to bladder cancer, but many of those have been banned, and modern formulations are considered much safer.
That's somewhat reassuring, but I think I'll still be wearing gloves next time I dye my hair, just in case. And good ventilation is key, right?
Absolutely.
Huh?
Whenever you're using those types of products, make sure you have good ventilation.
And let's not forget about some other common ingredients like coal tar, which is found in some shampoos and creams and triclosan, which used to be in antibacterial soaps. It's a reminder to really pay attention to what's in those seemingly harmless products we use every day.
Yeah, reading labels and doing your research can go a long way.
Okay, so deep divers, let's
Yeah.
take this conversation outside. Now, we've got to talk about environmental factors, and I think we can all relate to being stuck in traffic, breathing in exhaust fumes. But did you know that diesel exhaust is particularly concerning?
It's actually classified as a group 1 carcinogen, meaning there's solid evidence that it causes cancer in humans. That mix of soot benzene and nitrogen oxides is really bad news, and it's been linked to lung cancer.
And of course, we can't forget about secondhand smoke.
Okay.
There's no safe level of exposure to that, and it's linked to a whole range of cancers, so that's something we should all be mindful of.
Absolutely.
And here's one you might not have thought about, radon gas. It's naturally occurring, it's radioactive, and it can seep into homes and buildings, and it's actually the second leading cause of lung cancer after smoking.
Yeah, it's something that a lot of people don't know about, but the good news is you can test for radon in your home, and if the levels are high, there are steps you can take to mitigate it.
That's good to know now while we're talking about things we can't necessarily see. We can't forget about our friend, the sun. I mean, we all love a sunny day, but that UV radiation is a known carcinogen. It can lead to skin cancer.
Sun protection is crucial, sunscreen shade, and avoiding tanning beds. Those are definitely on the naughty list.
No safe tan, got it. So we've covered food, household products, personal care items, and environmental factors. Now, what's next on our list of everyday carcinogens?
Well, not all of these apply to everyone, but it's important to be aware of the potential dangers in the workplace.
You're right. Even if we don't personally work in those high-risk jobs, awareness is key.
So let's start with one you've probably heard of, asbestos. It was widely used in construction and insulation, and it's a known cause of mesothelioma, which is a type of cancer that affects the lining of the lungs and other organs.
And then there's silica dust, which is a concern for people in construction mining and sandblasting. It's generated when you're cutting or grinding materials like concrete, and it's a major risk factor for lung cancer.
Exactly, and we can't forget welding fumes. That mix of metallic oxides and UV radiation can be a real hazard potentially, leading to lung cancer and even eye cancer.
It's amazing how many risks are present in those jobs. So what other substances should people be aware of?
But we've got industrial solvents like trichloroethylene, which has been linked to kidney cancer, and vinyl chloride, which is used in plastics manufacturing and can cause a rare type of liver cancer.
And even something as seemingly harmless as wood dust can be a problem, right?
Absolutely. Long-term exposure to fine wood dust, especially for people who work with wood regularly, can increase the risk of nasal and sinus cancers.
It's incredible how many everyday materials can pose these hidden risks.
Yeah,
What else is on this list?
well, we still have beryllium, cadmium, nickel compounds, chromium 6, and coal tar to cover each with its own unique risks and ways that people might be exposed.
Wow, it seems like we've got a lot more ground to cover in part two of this deep dive. But before we wrap up this section, I'm curious, you mentioned coal tar and its historical link to scrotal cancer in chimney sweeps. That's one of the earliest connections between an occupation and cancer, right?
It is back in the 18th century, a British surgeon noticed a high incidence of scrotal cancer in those young chimney sweeps, and he correctly deduced that it was caused by their exposure to soot and coal tar, which are full of PAH.
That's fascinating and a bit horrifying to think that those observations from centuries ago helped shape our understanding of cancer today?
It really highlights how our environment can have such a profound impact on our health.
Well, deep divers, we've covered a lot of ground today, from barbecues to chimney sweeps, and it seems like carcinogens really are lurking everywhere. It's almost overwhelming to think about. But stay tuned for part 2 of this episode, where we'll continue to unravel this complex topic and hopefully empower you to make informed choices about your health. And we're back, deep divers, ready to plunge deeper into this sea of everyday carcinogens. And one area that really had me thinking, during our research was the whole thing about technology and radiation. I mean, we're surrounded by it constantly, but how often do we really stop and think about, the potential downsides?
It's true. We often take for granted how much technology we use, and it's easy to overlook the potential risks, but it's important to be aware of them so we can make informed decisions about our usage.
Absolutely. So we talked about the IRC and how they classify things as, possibly carcinogenic and all that. We touched on cell phones and Wi-Fi, but maybe we could break that down a little more, explain what it really means when something gets that possibly carcinogenic label.
Sure. So the IRC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, they're the ones who evaluate all sorts of things, substances, exposures, even occupations, based on the scientific evidence linking them to cancer. And they have this whole process, where they review all the studies and they weigh the evidence and then they come up with these classifications.
So it's not just, a random guess.
Yeah.
They've got a system. They're looking at the research, and based on that, they come up with these categories. So walk us through those categories again.
Okay, so they have four main categories. Group 1, that means the agent is definitely carcinogenic to humans. Group 2A means it's probably carcinogenic. Group 2B, that's possibly carcinogenic. And then Group 3 means it's not classifiable as to its carcinogenicity to humans, meaning they just don't have enough evidence to say one way or the other.
So cell phone radiation falls into that possibly carcinogenic category, group 2B. But does that mean we should all be, ditching our smartphones and going back to carrier pigeons or something?
Well, not necessarily. The evidence is still limited and more research is definitely needed, but it's a good reminder to be mindful of our usage. Simple things like using a headset or speakerphone and avoiding keeping your phone in your pocket all the time can help reduce your exposure.
That makes sense. Those are easy changes to make. Okay, now what about all those rumors about microwave ovens causing cancer? Should I be worried every time I, heat up my leftovers?
You can rest assured that microwave ovens, when used properly, are safe. They emit non-ionizing radiation, which is a type of radiation that doesn't have enough energy to directly damage DNA like X-rays do. So it's a completely different kind of radiation.
Okay, that's a relief. I was getting a little worried there for a second. I mean, I use my microwave practically every day, so no need to swap it out for a conventional oven just yet.
Not at all. And those rumors about microwaved food becoming radioactive, those are completely unfounded as well.
Good to
Yeah.
know. Good to know. All right, so microwaves were good there. But what about things like power lines and all those electrical devices in our homes? I mean, those emit electromagnetic fields, right? Are those something we should be concerned about?
Yes, they do. They emit what are known as extremely low frequency magnetic fields, or ELF fields for short. And the IARC has actually classified ELF magnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic as well, based on a possible link to childhood leukemia.
Childhood leukemia, that's scary. So I guess living near those big high voltage power lines might not be the best idea.
Yeah, probably not the best place to set up a playground or spend a lot of time, but for most people, the levels of ELF magnetic fields in their homes are well within safe limits, so it's not something to be overly concerned about unless you're living right next to one of those giant power lines.
Okay, that makes me feel a little better. Now, let's talk about something a bit more clear-cut, X-rays and CT scans. I mean, we know those use ionizing radiation,
Yeah.
and that can damage DNA and lead to cancer, especially at high doses. But
Mhm.
I guess the benefit of early detection outweighs the risk in most cases, right?
Exactly. In medicine, the doses used for diagnostic purposes are very low, and the benefits of early detection and accurate diagnosis, those usually outweigh the small risks associated with radiation exposure.
So we shouldn't be avoiding necessary medical imaging.
Not at all, but it's always a good idea to talk to your doctor, discuss any concerns you might have and ask about the risks and benefits of any procedure.
That's good advice. And just to reiterate, I think we've hammered this point home, but tanning beds are a big no-no, right?
Absolutely no safe tan, remember that.
Okay, got it. All right, so we've talked about a lot of stuff here. Things we ingest products, we use environmental factors, even technology. But what about workplace exposures? I mean, I think this is an area that people often overlook.
You're right, not everyone thinks about it, but the workplace can be a significant source of exposure to carcinogens.
And even if we don't personally work in those, high-risk jobs, I think it's still important to be aware of the potential hazards just in case.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power.
So let's dive into some of those workplace hazards. We already talked about asbestos and silica dust, but what about some of those other substances that people might not be as familiar with?
Sure. Well, let's start with beryllium. It's a lightweight metal, very strong, and it's used in a lot of different industries, from aerospace to electronics. But exposure to beryllium dust or fumes can lead to this serious lung condition called berylliosis, and that increases your risk of lung cancer.
Berylliosis, that's a
Yeah.
new one for me. So I guess this is mainly a concern for people who work with beryllium directly.
Yeah, for the most part, but it's possible for the general public to be exposed as well, through certain hobbies like metalworking or if you're using products that contain beryllium alloys.
So another good reminder to always, be aware of the materials you're working with.
Mm.
Take precautions, wear a mask,
Yeah.
especially if you're doing any kind of DIY projects or home renovations where you might be exposed to these kinds of things.
Exactly. Precautions are always a good idea. Now, let's move on to another metal with hidden dangers, cadmium. It's found in batteries, pigments, and even cigarette smoke.
Oh, wow, cadmium in cigarettes. I mean, as if smoking wasn't bad enough already.
Right. It's just one more reason to avoid smoking altogether, or secondhand smoke for that matter.
Absolutely. But
Yeah.
what about for non-smokers? Are there other ways we might be exposed to cadmium?
Well, some foods like shellfish and mushrooms can accumulate cadmium, but the levels are usually pretty low. Occupational exposure is the bigger concern, especially in industries like battery manufacturing and welding.
And you mentioned earlier that cadmium has been linked to several types of cancer.
Yes, long-term exposure to cadmium has been linked to lung cancer, kidney cancer, and prostate cancer, so it's definitely something to be mindful of.
So another reminder that even those everyday products, the things we take for granted, they can contain these hidden dangers. Okay, and we talked about nickel compounds earlier as well. Can you remind us about the risks associated with those?
Sure, so nickel metal itself is actually relatively harmless, but certain nickel compounds can be a problem if you inhale them. They've been linked to lung cancer and nasal cavity cancer, and that's primarily a risk for workers, involved in nickel refining and electroplating.
So another occupational hazard, but is there any risk for the average person, just going about their daily lives?
Well, it's possible to inhale small amounts of nickel dust when you're polishing or grinding metal objects, especially if they contain nickel alloys. So wearing a mask, when you're doing those kind of activities is always a good idea.
Good advice. Always good to take precautions. Now, what about that really long word we talked about earlier, hexavalent chromium?
Hexavalent chromium, also known as chromium 6. It's a mouthful, I know, but it's a powerful carcinogen, and it's been linked to lung cancer, nose, and sinus cancers. And you might remember it's used in chrome plating and paints.
Right, right. So workers in those industries are at higher risk. But you also mentioned that we might encounter it in some unexpected places like pressure-treated wood.
Yeah, pressure-treated wood that was treated before 2004, it used to contain a chemical called chromated copper arsenate. And as the name suggests, it contains both arsenic and chromium the ticks, so not something you want to be messing around with.
So if you're working with older pressure-treated wood, maybe doing some renovations or something, it's really important to take precautions.
Absolutely. Avoid creating dust when you're working with it. Wear a mask to minimize inhalation, all the usual safety measures.
It seems like a lot of these workplace carcinogens are things that, we might encounter during those DIY projects or home renovations.
You're right, and that's why it's so crucial to be informed and take appropriate safety measures, even for those, seemingly harmless weekend projects.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive,
Mhm.
I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier, coal tar, and its linked to scrotal cancer in chimney sweeps. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. So back in the 18th century, there was this British surgeon, Percival Pott, and he noticed that young boys who worked as chimney sweeps, they had a really high rate of scrotal cancer. And he correctly deduced that it was caused by their exposure to soot and coal tar, which are full of PAHs, those polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons we talked about earlier.
Wow, so those observations from centuries ago, they actually help shape our understanding of cancer today. That's amazing.
It's a testament to the power of observation and, scientific inquiry and how those early discoveries can have such a lasting impact.
And you mentioned that coal tar is still used in some products today.
Unfortunately, yes, some driveway sealants and roofing materials still contain coal tar, so it's important to be aware of that and choose safer alternatives whenever possible.
It's like even in our modern world, we're still grappling with some of these age-old carcinogenic hazards.
It's true. It's a constant process of learning and adapting and finding ways to minimize our risks.
Well, deep divers, we've explored a lot of ground in this section, everything from, cell phones and microwaves to beryllium and coal tar, and it's clear that carcinogens can be found in some pretty unexpected places.
Yeah.
But before we get too overwhelmed, let's remember that knowledge is power. The more we understand about these risks, the better equipped we are to make informed choices. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll wrap things up and explore some practical steps you can take to reduce your exposure to these everyday carcinogens. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of everyday carcinogens. We've covered a lot of ground in the previous parts, talking about all sorts of things from food and drinks to household products and even technology. And it can feel a little overwhelming, to think about all these potential risks lurking in our daily lives.
I agree. It's a lot to take in. But remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about these risks, the better equipped we are to make informed choices about our health and well-being.
That's a great point. So in this final part, let's shift our focus from, just being aware of these risks to actually taking action. What are some practical things we can do to, minimize our exposure and protect ourselves?
Well, there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Hmm.
The best approach is going to vary depending on individual circumstances and the specific carcinogens we're concerned about. But let's start with some general principles that can apply across the board.
Okay, that sounds like a good plan. Where should we begin?
Well, one of the most effective things we can do is simply be more mindful of what we're putting into and onto our bodies. Choosing organic produce whenever possible can help reduce exposure to pesticides, reading labels carefully, and opting for personal care products that don't contain harmful ingredients like parabens, phthalates, artificial fragrances. Those are all simple steps we can take.
That makes sense. It's amazing how much control we actually have just by, being conscious consumers and choosing safer alternatives.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of good ventilation. Opening windows using exhaust fans, even investing in an air purifier can make a big difference in terms of reducing indoor air pollution, which we know can contain a whole cocktail of carcinogens.
Especially all those volatile organic compounds that are released from things like paint cleaning products, new furniture.
Exactly. And speaking of those DIY projects and home renovations we talked about earlier, remember wearing protective gear like masks and gloves when you're working with those potentially hazardous materials? It might seem like a hassle, but it's a small price to pay for protecting your health.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of protective measures, let's talk about sun safety. We all know that UV radiation is a major risk factor for skin cancer. So what can we do to protect ourselves?
Well, the basics are always a good start. Seeking shade, wearing protective clothing, using sunscreen with an SPF of 30 or higher. And remember, those tanning beds are a definite no-no.
No safe tan, got it. But beyond those individual actions, what about those things we can't control on our own?
Yeah.
Like environmental pollution or workplace hazards?
Well, that's where collective action comes in, supporting policies that promote clean air and water, advocating for stricter regulations on industrial emissions, pushing for safer working conditions. Those are all ways we can make a difference.
It's a good reminder that, we're not just individuals navigating these risks, but we're part of a larger community and we have a shared responsibility to protect our collective health.
Exactly. And that community extends beyond our immediate surroundings. We need to think globally as well, supporting initiatives that address climate change, which has far-reaching implications for human health, including cancer risk.
It's a lot to think about, but it's also empowering to realize that we have agency both individually and collectively to make a difference.
Absolutely. And it's not about living in a bubble, or avoiding everything that might pose a risk. It's about finding that balance between enjoying our modern lives and taking reasonable steps to minimize those potential long-term risks.
So deep divers, as we wrap up this exploration, I want to leave you with a challenge. Take what you've learned today and turn it into action. Make one small change in your routine, advocate for a policy that promotes health, or simply share this knowledge with someone you care about.
Every little bit counts.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of everyday carcinogens. It's been quite a journey, but I hope you found it informative and empowering. And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay empowered to make choices that support your well-being.
And until next time, keep diving deep.